The first shell didn't whistle. That's what I remember. No warning scream. No cinematic howl. Just a pressure change in the air, like the sky inhaled, and then the earth beside our trench lifted itself into the air and came down in pieces. I didn't hear the explosion at first. I felt it in my ribs. Mud filled my mouth. My helmet was gone. My ears were ringing like church bells on Christmas morning in Cologne, except there was no church, no Christmas, just black soil and the sound of men choking. We were outside St. Lo, July 1944. And that was the first time I understood why we feared American artillery more than anything else in this war. Not their tanks. Not their planes. Not even their infantry. Their guns. You could survive a firefight. You could outweight a tank. You could hide from aircraft. But you could not hide from what we called the metal rain. I was 19. Grenadier, 352nd Infantry Division, the same division that had bled on Omaha Beach the month before. What was left of us had been pulled back into the hedgerows, the bocage, thick, ancient earth walls laced with roots and stone. They told us it was good defensive ground. They didn't tell us what it would sound like when the Americans decided to erase it. The first barrage lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes long enough to unmake a village. We later learned it was the U.S. 29th Infantry Division calling in fire from the 111th and 224th Field Artillery Battalions, 105 mm howitzers, M2A1s, and behind them, the heavier guns, 155s. At 19, I didn't know calibers. I only knew that when the shells landed, the hedgerows that had stood since Napoleon cracked open like rotten teeth. The ground didn't just shake. It liquefied. You couldn't tell where up was. I tried to press myself deeper into the earth, but the earth was trying to climb into me. The worst part wasn't the explosions. It was the waiting between them. American artillery had rhythm. 3 impacts left. Pause. 2 right. Long pause. Then a full battery salvo that made your teeth clack together. They walked it toward you. Deliberately. Someone, somewhere, was adjusting coordinates with mathematical calm while we clawed at the dirt like animals. You could feel their corrections tightening around your position. It was precise. Personal. After the first barrage, I found Otto. He had been beside me before the shells came. Now he was half buried, helmet split, eyes open, chest rising in shallow jerks like he was trying to remember how to breathe. There was no dramatic scream. Just wet coughing. I tried to drag him, but another shell hit close enough that the shockwave flattened us both. Dirt filled his mouth. When I wiped it away, I realized he wasn't blinking anymore. There is a moment after heavy artillery where everything goes silent. Not because the guns stop, but because your hearing leaves you. It's like being underwater. You see men shouting. You see smoke. You see limbs moving. But no sound. That silence is worse than the explosions. Because you know it's temporary. And the next wave is coming. We had fought the British near Caen before this. Their artillery was heavy, devastating. But the Americans, they fired faster. Relentless. Industrial. We learned later about their production numbers, how their factories fed the guns without pause. It didn't matter how many shells they fired. There were always more. They didn't conserve. They erased. When their forward observers spotted movement, they didn't hesitate. A radio call. Grid coordinates. And then the sky opened. We started digging deeper foxholes. It didn't matter. The 105s would collapse the edges. The 155s would cave in the roof. If you survived the blast, you feared suffocation. If you survived suffocation, you feared the next correction. On July 25th, everything changed. We heard aircraft first, a low vibration that grew into a wall of sound. Operation Cobra. We didn't know the name then. We only knew the horizon disappeared behind bombers. United States Army Air Force's heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, carpet bombing behind our lines. Some bombs fell short. We heard later they hit American troops too. It didn't matter to us. The ground convulsed for hours. Then came the artillery. Not scattered fire. Not probing. A wall. Battery after battery firing in coordinated waves. It wasn't aimed at trenches anymore. It was aimed at the concept of resistance. Men broke that day. Not from wounds. From anticipation. One of our sergeants began laughing after the third hour. High, thin laughter that didn't stop even when blood trickled from his ear. He kept saying, "They can't possibly have more." He was wrong. By afternoon, the bocage wasn't bocage anymore. It was splintered timber and churned mud. We tried to reposition. That's when we understood the real horror. American artillery didn't just destroy your position. It followed you. Forward observers in planes. Observers attached to infantry. Pre-registered coordinates. The moment we moved across open ground, the fire shifted. First shell long. Second short. Then right on top of us. It felt like being hunted by mathematics. I remember pressing my face into the mud, whispering numbers to myself. 1, 2, 3. Trying to guess the interval between salvos. If you could predict the rhythm, maybe you could move between heartbeats of destruction. But there was no safe beat. Only smaller explosions and larger ones. Some shells burst in the air, airburst, we learned later, sending fragments downward like steel rain. You couldn't hide from that. You could only pray the fragments chose someone else. And they often did. By evening, what remained of our company had retreated nearly a kilometer. Not because of tanks. Not because of infantry assaults. Because we could not stand under that sky anymore. When American ground troops finally advanced, they met scattered resistance. Exhausted men. Shaking hands. Eyes that flinched at every distant thud. We weren't defeated by heroics. We were hollowed out. Artillery does that. It doesn't just kill you. It removes the inside of you first. That night, in a shell crater that still smelled of cordite and earth, I couldn't sleep. Every rumble, thunder, trucks, distant doors, sounded like incoming fire. My hands trembled even when they were empty. I understood something then. This wasn't a battle for territory. It was a battle for nerve. And American artillery was designed to break nerve before it broke bodies. We began fearing the sound before the impact. Then we began fearing silence. Because silence meant they were recalculating. And recalculation meant the next salvo would be closer. Weeks later, we would hear rumors of the guns behind it all. Entire battalions firing in coordinated patterns, radar correcting trajectories, ammunition stacked like mountains. Industrialized destruction. Efficient. Cold. Impersonal. And yet it felt intimate. Like someone had placed a finger on your chest from miles away and decided exactly when your heart should stop. I survived St. Lo. Otto did not. Our sergeant who laughed stopped laughing 2 days later when a shell buried him alive. We dug for him. We found only part of him. And as we marched east, retreating through what was left of Normandy, the distant thunder never stopped. It followed us. Constant. Measured. Patient. That was when I realized something that never left me. You can hate an enemy soldier. But you cannot hate artillery. It has no face. Only coordinates. And it was waiting for us again, far worse, in the winter. And winter was where the real fear began. By December, the ground was iron. Not mud anymore. Not the soft, forgiving earth of Normandy. The Ardennes froze hard enough to break a shovel. When you tried to dig, sparks came off the blade. We were near Bastogne. That name still tightens my chest. People remember the encirclement, the paratroopers, the word nuts. They remember defiance. I remember the sound before impact. Our unit, remnants folded into elements supporting Panzer Lehr Division, pushed through snow-clogged roads under cover of fog. The offensive had begun days earlier, Battle of the Bulge. We were told the Americans were surprised. We were told their lines were thin. We were told fuel depots waited for us. What we weren't told was that even surrounded, even cut off, American artillery never seemed to run out. The first time we felt it in the Ardennes, it was different from Normandy. Normandy was chaos. This was calculation. The forest swallowed sound. Snow dampened echoes. You would hear a distant thump, muted, almost polite, and then nothing for a heartbeat. Then the trees above you would explode. American shells bursting in the canopy. Airburst. Fragments slicing downward through pine branches like scythes. Men weren't thrown apart like in St. Lo. They were perforated. Tiny entry wounds. Massive exits. Snow turning pink in soft, quiet blooms. The forest made it intimate. There was no wide horizon of destruction. Just your squad, your breath, your heartbeat, and then metal tearing through branches overhead. We learned the name whispered with something like superstition. The American 101st Airborne Division held Bastogne. But it wasn't just paratroopers we feared. It was the guns backing them. Even encircled, they coordinated artillery like a living organism. Forward observers hidden in church towers, attic windows, tree lines. Radios crackling through the snow. We would advance cautiously. Nothing. Silence. Too much silence. Then a single ranging shot. Always slightly off. Long. Short. Left. Right. They were finding us. You could feel it happening. The second round closer. The third close enough that snow fell from branches. Then the full battery. It felt like someone had dropped a cathedral onto the forest. I was assigned to a half-track that week, SD, KFZ. 251, carrying ammunition forward. The engine whined in the cold, oil thick as syrup. We moved at night when we could. It didn't matter. American artillery had something new by then, proximity fuses. We didn't know the term at the time. We only knew shells were detonating above us without touching anything. Invisible tripwires in the sky. You couldn't dig deep enough. You couldn't hug the earth tight enough. The explosion would happen 10 meters above, and fragments would come down like a storm. I saw a man killed without a crater anywhere near him. Just a sudden jerk. A hole in his throat. Steam rising from his collar. There is a particular terror in artillery that rifles don't have. With rifles, you at least imagine the man aiming at you. With artillery, you are erased by strangers who cannot see your face. It is industrial, distant, and because it is distant, it feels unstoppable. We tried counter-battery fire, but American guns repositioned quickly. Their logistics were monstrous. Trucks bringing shells even through snowstorms. They fired in coordinated time on target missions. We learned that term later from captured documents. Multiple batteries, different distances, firing so their shells arrived simultaneously. No warning sequence. No walking adjustment. Just sudden annihilation. On December 23rd, the skies cleared. We thought that meant relief. It meant visibility. American aircraft returned, P-47 Thunderbolts strafing roads, but the artillery was what hollowed us out. We attempted to push along the road toward Bastion's perimeter. Our column stretched too long. Someone saw us. The first shell hit the rear vehicle. The second landed ahead. They bracketed us. Classic. Within 30 seconds, the entire road was a corridor of explosions. Half tracks burned in white snow. Fuel ignited black smoke columns that stood out like signals. Men ran into the forest, which is exactly where the airbursts began. They had registered the tree line. They were waiting for us to do the predictable thing. And we did. I lay behind a fallen pine, face in snow, counting again. 1, 2, 3, trying to map the pattern. But in the Ardennes, patterns shifted. The Americans adjusted rapidly, correcting fire with terrifying speed. Their communication lines held even when surrounded. We, on the other hand, lost radios to cold batteries and broken wires. Coordination faltered. Fear filled the gaps. The worst moment came not during the barrage, but after, when it stopped. Snow drifted down through broken branches. Engines crackled as they burned. Somewhere a man screamed for his mother, not in German, but in a dialect from Bavaria I barely understood. Then nothing. Just whined through shattered trees. We began moving again because standing still felt like inviting correction. And as we moved, every snapped twig sounded like incoming. Every distant rumble, thunder or artillery. You couldn't tell. Your body reacted before your mind. Flinch. Drop. Cover your head. Even when nothing came. By New Year's, the offensive had stalled. Fuel ran thin. The Americans brought more guns. More shells. More aircraft. We began retreating again. And that was the pattern of the war from then on. Advance briefly. Be located. Be calculated. Be shelled. Retreat. It wasn't dramatic collapse. It was erosion. Like waves against a cliff. Every day the cliff weaker. Every day the sea louder. Some men said they preferred Russian artillery on the Eastern Front. That sounds insane. But what they meant was this. The Soviets fired massive barrages, terrifying, yes, but often less precise. American artillery felt surgical. It felt like someone had drawn a circle around you on a map and decided you no longer existed. Precision is more frightening than chaos. Because precision implies intention. On January 16th, when the encirclement of Bastogne was broken, we were already pulling back. Not in panic. Not in rout. Just in a steady, exhausted withdrawal. I hadn't slept properly in days. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that muted thump in the distance. The forest canopy tearing open. Fragments coming down. And I understood something deeper than before. We weren't afraid of dying in battle. We were afraid of waiting to die without ever seeing what killed us. That kind of fear grows roots. It stays long after the war. Long after the guns stop. And they did stop eventually. But not before the Rhine. Not before the Americans brought their guns even closer. And when they did, there was nowhere left to retreat. By March 1945, retreat wasn't movement anymore. It was gravity. Everything pulled west. And the Americans followed with their guns. We were near the Rhine when we first heard about the bridge at Remagen. They said the Americans had taken it intact. The Ludendorff Bridge. We laughed when we heard it. Rumors had been wild before. But this one was true. On March 7th, elements of the 9th Armored Division crossed the Rhine. Not weeks later. Not after perfect preparation. Immediately. And once they were over, the artillery followed. You must understand something. Up until then, the Rhine had been psychological. A final barrier. A line on the map that meant Germany. Once the Americans were across, the war wasn't something happening somewhere else. It was happening in our backyards. And their artillery didn't need to reach far anymore. The distance between the guns and us was shrinking, which meant corrections came faster. Bracketing tightened quicker. The time between spotting and destruction shortened. You could feel it. The delay was gone. I was attached to a mixed group of infantry and Volkssturm near a small village east of Remagen. Old men. Boys. A few veterans like me who no longer believed in speeches. We dug shallow positions because the ground was thawing, soft and sour. There is a smell when spring mud mixes with old cordite and rot. It stays in your nose. You taste it even when you're not there. The first American shells landed mid-morning. No massive prelude. Just correction. One round long. Second short. We all froze. The boys didn't understand yet. The old men did. They had seen 1918. They knew that pattern. I started counting automatically. 1, 2, 3. The full salvo hit before I reached 6. This wasn't Normandy's chaos or Ardennes' canopy bursts. This was proximity and precision combined. 105s and 155s firing from secure bridgeheads. Counter-battery radar guiding corrections. The air itself seemed calibrated. Houses collapsed inward like lungs punctured. Window glass became knives. The church steeple snapped at its base and folded into the street. You didn't see the enemy. You saw structures disappear. You saw men erased mid-sentence. A boy next to me, 17, maybe, asked where the guns were. I pointed west. He stared at the horizon as if he might spot them. As if he could shoot back with a rifle. That was the cruelty of American artillery by 1945. It was untouchable. Protected by air superiority. Supplied by a machine that never tired. Connected by radios that rarely failed. You weren't fighting soldiers. You were fighting coordination. By afternoon, our line no longer existed. Not broken. Not overrun. Just flattened. The Americans advanced cautiously behind their rolling barges. Creeping fire. It moved ahead of them like a mechanical storm front. When it lifted, their infantry appeared. Clean helmets. Steady movement. We fired sporadically. Some ran. Some stayed. It didn't matter. The next fire mission was already inbound. At some point, something inside me stopped reacting. The fear that had once made my heart pound now felt distant. Like I was observing myself from outside. A shell detonated near enough to throw me against a wall. My ears rang, but I didn't panic. I just lay there, watching dust drift through sunlight. I realized I was tired of anticipating death. Tired of calculating intervals. Tired of trying to outthink mathematics. For months I had been living in 10-minute segments. Survive this barrage. Survive the next correction. Survive until night. But there was no more west. No more space to trade for time. In late March, as American forces expanded their bridgehead and poured across the Rhine, we were ordered to withdraw again. But the roads were cratered. Bridges destroyed. Refugees clogged every path. Artillery followed the routes instinctively. Intersections. Rail lines. Assembly areas. They didn't need to see us. They knew where we would go. Because there were only so many options left. I watched a column of civilians scatter when shells began landing among wagons. No military targets, just movement. War had reduced everything to coordinates. And then one evening, after a week that blurred into noise and smoke, it stopped. Not permanently, but for hours. No ranging shots. No distant thumps. Just wind. I didn't trust it. Silence had always meant recalculation. I waited for the next correction. It didn't come. Instead, word filtered down. American units had bypassed us. We were no longer worth the ammunition. They were driving deeper, faster. The guns had moved on. That was the final insult. Not destruction. Irrelevance. For months we had been hunted by unseen batteries. Measured. Erased. Now we weren't even targets. Just debris. When Germany surrendered in May, I was in a makeshift camp near the river. No dramatic last stand. No final charge. Just exhaustion. I remember hearing distant celebratory gunfire from American lines. It sounded different from artillery. Sharp. Up close. Human. And I realized something that unsettled me more than the war itself. I could no longer separate ordinary thunder from incoming fire. Even after the guns stopped for good, my body didn't believe it. Years later, in peacetime, a car backfiring would send me to the ground. A construction site hammer would freeze my breath. Because American artillery had taught me something permanent. Death does not need to see you. It only needs your coordinates. People ask why we feared it more than tanks. Why more than aircraft? Why more than infantry? Because tanks can miss. Pilots can be shot down. Infantry can hesitate. Artillery does not hesitate. It calculates. And then it arrives all at once. You never see the face of the man who orders it. You never know the gun crew loading the shell. You never hear the decision being made. You only feel the conclusion. If you read history books, they talk about fire superiority. Logistics. Industrial output. They use numbers. Tonnage. Caliber. Rounds fired. I remember the space between impacts. The taste of dirt. The way a forest canopy shattered above us. The way silence felt heavier than explosions. Victory, they call it. For them, it was. For us, it was erosion until nothing inside remained. That is why we hated American artillery. Not because it killed the most men, but because it killed the idea that you had any control over your own survival. And once that idea is gone, you are already defeated.